Thank you very much indeed, Aris and Steve. I think Eric really made the point in chat when the point was made about what a wonderful input session that you've just shared with us. I've been lucky enough to watch it twice now, live just now.
You poor fool, you poor fool.
What was interesting is that before the input session, a number of people responded to the reflective questions that you put up for us, one of which was relating to the number of people who read peer-reviewed professional journals. And quite of the number that people replied, the majority said no. So perhaps can we start there? And a bit of a compound question, if I may. Which peer-reviewed journals would you recommend as a accessible introduction into the field of SLA? And why is it you think that perhaps many teachers just don't go there?
Thank you, Neil, for putting my feet right on the flames. The key word in your question, I think, is accessible. And frankly, I don't think that any peer-reviewed journal is accessible unless you're already immersed to some degree, at least, in the literature.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, what I'm doing is answering both parts of your question. It's not accessible, and therefore teachers generally don't. Some do, but mostly don't. I mean, if I had to recommend a journal, a peer-reviewed journal, it would be ELTJ, which I think is the oldest, and could be wrong there. But it's very good and it's very interesting. But unless you know some of the terminology, in other words, unless you've done some work trying to familiarize yourself with what's going on in the world of SLA research, you're not going to get that much out of it. At least I'm talking also from personal experience, because when I began to look at research, somebody did give me a DVD with a lot of PDFs from ELTJ, and most of them I couldn't make head or tail of, to be honest. Sorry, Neil. So instead of peer-reviewed journals, I would suggest that some of the teachers, we'll call them magazines, if you want, like English Teaching Professional, and so on. I think that the magazines can probably be of more use, at least. It's true that they serve different purposes, of course, but I think if you don't know about SLA, if you haven't really dipped your feet in the water, then it's asking a lot of people to throw them into ELTJ or other peer-reviewed journals.
I'm just putting into chat ETP and also MET, Modern English Teacher.
Yep.
It's Vista magazine, which I think are both really good quality ways of kind of getting into this. You also referred at the very beginning of the input session to some of the introductory books that are out there. Yep. And that kind of set me thinking, well, you know, what would I recommend? And I was thinking perhaps as a good read, both for me as an English language teacher, but as a language learner, was Lightbound and Sparda's How Languages Are Learned, now in its 5th edition.
Yep.
Because actually, the first time I ever looked at it, it was a bedtime book. What would be your recommendation as a kind of accessible book way into the topic? Alice.
Yes, Alice, yes. Now, this is a big, let me just clarify what I'm talking about here. I've got a little list of books that I've made, and I'll put on the chat in a moment. But this is a massive book. It's a tome. And it was written a little while ago. And in fact, all the books that I'm going to put on the list on the chat in a moment were written a long time ago, not a long time ago, but they weren't written yesterday. And this is quite deliberate. I think that if you're going to start moving into SLA research, it's a brilliant idea to go back in time a little bit and see where we've come from. I promote this idea in almost everything I talk about where teaching is concerned. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. go back and have a look at what Ellis was saying in 1995, for example. And 9 times out of 10, you'll find that what was being said then is actually still valid, or it still has an element of validity. So, and of course, the other advantage to this is that this book that I just showed you, this is the study of second language acquisition, is available secondhand now. So you haven't got to pay 150 quid for it. You can probably buy it for 10 quid somewhere on the net, and if no one can find it, you can buy it from me for 10 quid. No, I'm not selling not selling mine.
We've had a question in Q&A, which I think is an interesting one, which kind of moves things away from what might be seen as the kind of the dry, I don't believe it is, but some people might characterize it as the dry pursuit of reading, through to actually engaging in action research as practitioners, and how helpful that might be. Now, action research can cover lots of things, not just SLA, but what are your thoughts on the value and perhaps some tips for practitioners who want to use action research as a way of perhaps clarifying or getting into SLA?
Absolutely. I've supported action research from, well, since I've heard about it, let's say for the last 30 years. I think it's brilliant. I think it's brilliant that teachers can become researchers. What they're doing is not the same as what researchers do in their ivory towers, of course. It's got an immediate, practical, and presumably then beneficial effect on what teachers do in the classroom. And that's where I'm coming from. The couple of times in my career that I've tried to set up something like this, I'm disappointed to say that it hasn't worked. Now, that may be because of me, I don't know, but it may also be because teachers expect things to happen for them. Now, people may not like this very much, but this is my experience. If you want to do action research, fantastic, but it will require a good deal of effort. You won't get paid for it. No one will pat you on the back. Well, I might, but you certainly won't get any money for it. And you're already busy. You're already doing a job which requires a good deal of time and expertise. So adding to your burden by setting up a valid action research project, it's really going to be tough. Having said that, anybody who wants to do that and wants some help from me is more than welcome to get in touch. I would do everything I possibly could to assist.
It's interesting you raise this challenge of what we might describe as working conditions. And that actually was a conversation that you and I were having recently, which followed on from questions around how teachers are trained. Now, I think you quite rightly said that we need to be mindful that the way that language teachers are trained outside the UK is often much on a course that is much longer than the typical 4-week introduction that we have here in the UK, the CELTA, the CERT TESOL, or similar. So what, if you had your magic wand, and in a way you have done because of your role previously as senior lecturer in applied linguistics, how would you like to see second language acquisition embedded into teachers' training? Yeah. And at what point do you think that could ideally occur?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there's at least one person in the chat room who was trained by me, and possibly others, but there's certainly one that I know of. And she will probably recall, or maybe I'm being a bit conceited here, but she may recall that we did a session on SLA research. So I prefer to call these new teachers rather than trainees. And so within that 4-week course, which might seem terribly short to people who've done a 3-year degree in English language teaching, we managed to cover some aspects of second language acquisition theory, which correspond almost directly with the stuff that we've been talking about today. So what I'm saying is that much of the stuff that we're talking about today was chosen specifically to help new teachers get into the job that they had to do. As I said, these are things that I wish I'd known when I first started teaching. And so I've tried to introduce it. So my feeling is that you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink, but you can present this stuff to new teachers in the hope that they're going to be curious and they're going to think, hang on a minute, this could be useful for me later on. I'm going to go back and have a look at the literature. That's my feeling. And it should be part of the curriculum of the exam boards who oversee these courses. Unfortunately, I don't think it is anymore. It isn't.
I mean, certainly from my experience of both running CELTA and TESOL programs here in the UK, that it isn't a requirement. I think it kind of historical traditions, I guess here we're in the realm of approaches, is something that Trinity asks for in the CERT TESOL, but of course that really isn't the same thing as SLA. But perhaps it might, and sorry for putting you on the spot here, because I have no idea how to answer this question myself, but is there, in your view, one or a couple of overarching approaches to language teaching which marries good SLA applications in order to achieve the best possible learning and also teaching? People talk about task-based learning, don't they?
Yes. It's an interesting question because you don't know this, but I'm currently writing a podcast on exactly this, and I wrote about 1,000 words today. So, but I'm not going to preempt that. I don't think what you're asking, in a sense, is what the perfect method is, and of course there isn't one. There are methods or approaches which are supported by aspects of SLA research. Lexical approach is one of them. Task-based learning is another, but then again, so is audiolingualism, because that was the, if we go back, that was the first method that was actually supported by science, and it was a dreadful failure, of course. So what's the answer? The answer is that there isn't one. I hate to use the word eclecticism because I've been pulled through a hedge backwards by somebody who thought I was trying to plagiarize this term some years ago. But I come back to the idea that teachers need support to develop their own way of working. You don't have to be a task-based learning teacher. You do not have to be a community language learning teacher. You don't have to be a suggestive, whatever it is. You don't have to be that. You can actually intelligently pluck things from here and there. You can also use the research to find out what is likely to work. You'll never find out what will work, but you can intelligently look at what has been said and what's available in the literature. And so the answer is very unsatisfactory, I'm afraid, Neil. I can't really give you one. As you said, you couldn't answer it. Well, neither can I.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that people like Mike Long in Barcelona recently sadly died, and also Jeffrey Jordan, also in Barcelona, are really pushing task-based learning as being what they feel is the best possible solution. I don't think they go as far as to say that it is the only one. And, certainly principled eclecticism, plus, of course, the teacher's own sense of kind of, this does feel right, which I think does emerge.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I have always liked task-based learning. And I do think that it's attractive to teachers because it has a pretty much a set paradigm. If we look at a communicative approach, nobody has ever, I mean, if there are 43 people on this forum at the moment, if we asked, I'm not going to, but if we asked all of them to write down what they think the communicative approach is, we would have at least 20 different versions. And nobody really knows what it is because it's got a language theory, but it hasn't got a learning theory. Whereas and therefore many teachers have steered away from it, or they've done what they think is the communicative approach, but it hasn't really worked very well. Task-based learning, on the other hand, is quite I'm getting old, I'm forgetting my words. It tells you what to do. It's prescriptive. It says this is the cycle. Now, there are
Yeah.
various versions of that cycle, it's true, but ultimately you've got something to hold on to. You can say, this is where we are in the cycle, and this is what I'm doing, and we know what's going to come next. And that also applies to learners, actually, because very often they like the security of knowing what's going to happen next.
Yes. I can see that we've got a number of teacher colleagues who have raised their hands as attendees. So Mohammed, Nazma, Zainab, and Fatima. Can I encourage the four of you, if you could please, to initially pop any questions that you have into chat? I see NASA has raised the point about artificial intelligence. I mean,
that seems to be only coming to hosts and panelists. It hasn't gone to everybody. So people.
Oh, okay. Shall I read it aloud?
Yes, please.
Also, using artificial intelligence through active strategies is a good tool in order to build new skills with deep knowledge. Interesting. Do you think that as neuroscience progresses, have we already seen, do you think we will see some kind of light bulb happening, that we start to understand a little bit more about things like natural order and developmental sequences, and that maybe might revolutionize language learning and then perhaps can be applied by AI? Any thoughts on that one?
I haven't thought about AI for this at all, but I'm very wary of saying that anything is going to change the status quo. I mean, if you look back at our history, going back to, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, if you look at all the stuff which was fated, I mean, language laboratories were going to do it, weren't they? And then we had PPP was going to do it, and I collect old course books because I love the history of what we do. And if you look through them, you'll see that there's a progression. And if you look at something like co-build, for example, this is the lexical approach. They use the lexical approach. And this was going to be the answer to all our problems. There is no answer to all our problems. And I don't believe there ever will be. I think we may come up with more accurate information about order and sequence of acquisition. I think we may come up with some of the answers to the stickier questions about, particularly to do with the psychology of learning language, which I think is, I haven't touched on that today because it's too big a subject. It would need a whole workshop or even two, to just look at that from above, so to speak. And so my belief, you call me old-fashioned, but I think that we're not going to see a great kind of volcano of brilliance suddenly emerging, and people say, okay, that's the answer. Also to say is that if you look around the world, there are teachers who are still doing grammar translation, and they're doing it, it's not their fault. They're doing it because that's what's expected of them. So somebody in the hierarchy, at the top of the hierarchy, has not kept up. And so they're being, in a sense, forced to use a method which is outmoded, outdated, anachronistic. And so I'm not very optimistic about your suggestion.
As you mentioned the word method there, I noticed a couple of days ago, Philip Kerr has recently published with CUP 30 trends in ELT. And one of the ones that I haven't read it yet, but I see from the blurb, that translanguaging and the whole kind of translanguaging turn features. In terms of SLA, I think there is a sometimes knotty relationship between the use of L1 in the classroom and whether it impedes or whether it in fact enhances second language acquisition. What advice would you give to teachers who perhaps have been told by ministries of education, the head of department, the head teacher, mustn't have L1 in the classroom? Any thoughts on L1 as a developmental tool that enhances SLA.
Yeah, great. When I started teaching, there are two things that were important. One was that you never used L1 in the classroom because you couldn't, because we had students from 30 different countries. And that was a great process for training. And the other thing was it was just considered not right to you. The argument went that students should be given every possible chance to be exposed to L2. And therefore, my first, probably 20 years of teaching, I avoided using L1 and became expert at it. I became expert at drawing things which represented other things, and I became expert at using language to get my point across, even with complete beginners. And of course, the quiz and error rods, you mustn't forget those. So get my little dig in there. And then little by little, I began to think, well, actually, hang on a sec. There are times when it might be quicker to use L1 for a term, for a word. It might even be okay to use L1 as long as you've got a homogeneous group, linguistically homogeneous group. It might be useful to be able to compare one structure with another as long as they are comparable in some way. So then I began to change my way of working, and I started to experiment a little and throw in a word here and a word there. And I think, so my advice, to go back to your question, my advice is two parts, really. Number one is be very, very careful, because I've observed teachers all over the world, and so many of them run their lessons in L1 and only occasionally slip into L2, and that should be turned around, basically. So you have to train yourself to be able to teach without using L1. When you can do that, then you can start to introduce L1 where it's where you feel it's actually going to be beneficial. And then, like everything else that you do as a teacher, you watch the result. Does it work? Has that achieved what you wanted to achieve? Or was it better to get students to invest a little more in their own learning?
Yes. I mean, I think I've been on a similar journey, albeit really for the last 5 years. Virtually everything that I've been doing has been working with teachers rather than with students. And certainly with teachers, I think the principled use of L1 can certainly help in the development of teacher competencies. But I do remember a gallery teacher's masterclass delivered, if I remember correctly, by Anne-Sophie Coucault, who works in Belfast. And she works in an ESOL context, where in fact she's very happy to have multiple L1s in the classroom simultaneously, wrestling with what I think effectively is negotiation of meaning. And she uses her teacher instincts to work out, have they actually grasped the point? Is the body language, is the intonation suggesting that a point has come across, or is there still confusion? I think probably looking there at kind of working with declarative knowledge, and of course there is that issue of how that becomes procedural. There is a follow-up question, I think, to the one about AI, going back more generally, and I know as your passion for history of methodology and also SLA, the question is, has neuroscience changed anything about SLA so far? That's an interesting one. What do you think?
It is. I think no. My initial response is no. But I think that if you speak to some of the proponents of neurosciences in language learning, they will disagree with me. You see, one of the things that I'm very, very wary of and fight against is these things that become add-ons. There are things like critical thinking, mindfulness, and there's a whole list of them. And one of them is the area of neuroscience and how we should be doing this or we should be doing that. We should be adding this in. Look, we've got as a language teacher, you have a tremendously difficult job. There's no getting away from that. This is not. I'd rather teach double bass than teach language, to be honest. It's easier. But layer upon layer of additional stuff is being proposed. And I want to drag us, I want to drag all of us, 44 people here. I want to drag you all kicking and screaming back to what we're supposed to be doing. A simplified form of posturing the learning or the acquisition of language. We don't need all that stuff because it's not ready yet. It's just not ready. When neuroscience comes up with the answers, I'll be the first one, I'll probably be dead, but otherwise I'll be the first one there to say, I subscribe, I'm here, I'll do it. But it hasn't got there yet. And so we're wandering about unqualified. We're unqualified as critical thinkers, most of us. We're unqualified as mindfulness experts. We're not experts in mindfulness unless we are. We're also not neuroscientists unless we are. And if you are, why are you earning €2 an hour as a language teacher and not €300 an hour as a scientist?
As you were giving that very eloquent response, one of the things that was going through my mind was a colleague of mine, or a former colleague, who is doing a lot of work as a cognitive SLA researcher using eye tracking. And as I thought about Vivian at Swansea University, one of the things that occurred to me is that she is an academic with a kind of neuroscience element to what she does, but also trained here in the UK, did a PGCE, and spent a number of years teaching French in quite a, what might be called in the UK, a bit of a tough school in the Northeast. Do you think that SLA researchers need to be language teachers first and then become SLA? Need is a difficult word, isn't it? Is there a benefit for the SLA researcher to be a language teacher as well?
No, I refer myself to two of my previous colleagues that I worked with at a university who were both originally language teachers and both went on to become, one of them particularly became quite well-known researcher who treated teachers with quite some disdain, let's say. She felt that she'd risen above them. And so it's a matter of personality. It's not a matter of your experience. You might, I mean, many people, I think, have done the journey that I've done, which is to go from pure practitioner into being, so I hesitate to call myself an academic, but into academia at least. And somehow I managed to con my way through that. Nobody really recognized how dim I really am. Yeah. And so the answer is no. I think it's a matter of personality.
And of course, in terms of that nexus, the teacher-learner classroom nexus, quite often, whilst there is the negativity of the cult of personality, you know, they're a lovely person, therefore a great teacher, rubbish. But do you think that the teacher personality and the student personality coming together is in some way important for SLA? And I'm thinking here of Rose Senior's work and her grounded theory, trying to establish what made good classrooms. Now, I don't think she ever said what made good learning. She was talking about what makes good classrooms. And she actually thought it was to do with creating the group. What are your thoughts on the interface between the teacher quality and enhancing SLA, either for the individual or for the class? Is there any research that's been done on that? Anything we can learn from it?
Not that I know of. This is a bit of a side. What do they call in baseball? A side ball, not a side ball, but
curve. Is it a curve ball?
It's a curve.
Sorry.
No. It's okay. No, I'm rapidly racking my brains trying to think of who it was, and I honestly can't do it right now. But somebody said, it was Carl Rogers. There we go. Carl Rogers, Freedom to Learn. He said, better to be yourself than to pretend to be something else when you're teaching. And he was referring particularly to teachers who pretend to like their students. This is really controversial, I think, and I'm not even sure that it's going to answer your question, but it might come rubbing against it in a sense. So his message was, even if you don't like students, he said, well, we're all human beings, and there are people that you like and people that you don't like. Why should you have to cover that up in some way? You should be yourself in the classroom. And I've always felt that was very sound advice, but extremely difficult to do. On the other hand, of course, you can respect someone without necessarily liking them. And so
Yes.
perhaps that's a part of the answer. How that relates to SLA directly, I honestly don't know. I can't think. Someone's written, because you're paid to be nice. No, I was never paid to be nice. Absolutely, they'd be wasting their money if they tried to pay me to be nice.
It's interesting because one of the things I say right at the beginning of a training course is, don't try and be your trainer. Secondly, don't be anything other than yourself.
Yeah.
And don't look to be popular.
Yeah.
Look to be respected for doing the best possible job that you can in the circumstances.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. Look, there's a question that's also gone to hosts and panelists. Perhaps I can read that. This is from Dhareni Nasser. But in the near future, many small jobs of English teacher will disappear and replaced by robots as an English teacher, especially in learning and teaching pronunciation. I couldn't disagree more. I'd like to be able to disagree more, but I can't. I don't think that's ever going to happen, at least certainly not in my, perhaps 100 years from now, we might have the technology. But if you think about the varieties of well, just looking at pronunciation, since that's mentioned, what's the model we're going to use? We can't use a native speaker model anymore, surely. So even if once you start to delve into this, you think, well, it's actually quite impossible. It can't be done. Can't be done. No.
And I think, there have been, in the same way that, the death of general English has been suggested for decades, likewise the death of the teacher. But, we've just been through the pandemic, which, if anything, was the opportunity for the teacher to be moved and sidelined. And it simply didn't happen. Yeah, in my experience, the nearest we get to the automatization of teaching is asynchronous learning. Students didn't want that. They wanted a teacher on Zoom. So yeah, I'd agree with you there. There's another question which is in the Q&A that's asking about the simultaneous teaching of multiple macro skills in the classroom. For example, teaching speaking and listening in one session.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I love this question. I can't even wait for you to finish. I love that question. It's been phrased in a way that I wouldn't have personally done, teaching multiple macro skills. I had to think for a moment before I understood what that means. But I have never subscribed to that idea of having a lesson on listening, or having a lesson on speaking, or a lesson on writing, and so on. I've always believed in the integration of skills. I've always thought that a classroom should become as close to the real world as you can possibly get it. This is something else I'm writing about in the podcast that I'm doing. But it's a bit of a pie in the sky. It's a bit of an idea which can never happen, because a classroom is remote from the real world. There's no question about that. But how far can we drag it into the real world, really? And so in a lesson of, say, 50 minutes, I'm going to have quite a lot of speaking, but it's going to be overlapped with some little writing tasks and probably some little listening tasks, maybe 2 or 3 in that lesson. I'm never, ever going to separate those, what we were calling skills. I'm not quite sure why we do, but I'm never going to separate those out so that they become discrete. They're always going to be welded together, melded together, overlapping one with another. In other words, if you're going back to the idea of task-based learning, therefore, if you have a task to perform, there should be involved in that task, in my view at least, various so-called skills So it shouldn't just be a reading or a listening or a speaking task. It should be integrated with all kinds of other stuff. Sorry, Neil, someone's asking for the name of the podcast. I can't tell you yet because I haven't finished it.
I think also I'm right in saying that in terms of kind of that integration, there is emergent research looking at dual processing, and in particular looking at how for English, and I'm not sure whether this is SLA for English or whether it works for other languages. I think probably primarily for English, I'll explain, is that if we delay the provision of the written form of the word, and that the students play with it, they've heard it, they see it, meaning is given clearly, and that they have perhaps just done something as simple as drilled it, and then they see it, that is likely to contribute to the longer term acquisition of the correct pronunciation of that word than if they've seen it first. So when we give out vocabulary worksheets, and students match vocabulary and then they do a listening, that in fact, if we don't do it like that, but we perhaps tell a story in which has the blocking vocabulary in it, which is presented through the audio channel only, but we may actually enable students to not get their own expectation of how the word is pronounced because they've seen it first.
Absolutely.
So, it's interesting, isn't it, that there are these little nuggets, but it's a question of how do we get those nuggets presented.
I think we need to think less in linear terms and more in holistic terms. I think less in atomistic terms. I mean, I'm still meeting people who say things like, I taught the present continuous yesterday, and I don't know what that means. I honestly don't know what it means. But we need to be thinking in another way. We need to be thinking about how first language acquisition occurs. I know that first language acquisition and second language acquisition are not identical, but I do think there's a good deal of useful compare and contrast to make with first language acquisition. And if you think about how kids are exposed to a huge variety of language around them, they may be playing with Lego on the floor while mum and dad are talking about buying a new car or whatever it is. But this stuff is around them. It's exposure. This is really important, I think.
Perhaps as NASA's come up with another question.
Just before that, sorry, Neil. Before that, there's another one. Maybe it's Gabby, I'm not sure. Do you think that real integration of skills can only be achieved by very experienced teachers? It requires years and years of experience. No, I don't. I don't. I think it's a matter of training. I think if you're trained, as I was, to do a listening and do a reading, as they used to say, then yes, it does require some shifting of your processing. You've got to think again. But if today, in the 21st century, you're training as a language teacher, surely there are people who can get you to appreciate that instead of doing a half hour of reading, you do 5 minutes of reading, and then you do overlap that with something which is connected somehow to a listening activity or a task. And so I don't think it really takes years and years unless you were originally set in that mold. If you were originally set in that mold, then yes, it is going to take some shifting to change, but it can be done, I promise you.
And I guess also that modern course books, although they are by their very nature, you just look at the course map, relatively granular, relatively atomistic. Nevertheless, in a double page spread, you have got a nice movement from one skill to another. And I think in that respect, it just, at the end of the day, it makes the time in the class a little bit more rich. It makes it richer, makes it more fun. I think fun's hugely important.
Absolutely.
As the SLA expert, are there any questions that you've not been asked that you wish had been asked and that you'd now like to finish with? I wish they'd asked us this.
No, not really. No, Neil, I think that we've had some great questions, and given the short time available to us, I I'd say thank you very much for asking the questions that you did. I hope that I've managed to swerve somebody, even just one person, into thinking a little bit more about SLA research.